The current series, The Habits of Grace. And my hope was that from the beginning of the year up until around Easter time, and this is going a little longer than I had originally planned, but for us to gather together to commit to these habits, these disciplines, so that as we this year get to experience Holy Week, to experience Good Friday and Easter Sunday together as God's people, that we would have a renewed sense of being close to God in our relationship to Him, to one another, through these spiritual disciplines. And so my aim is to finish our sermon series up until Palm Sunday and to go into Holy Week, finishing off this sermon series. The goal of the Habits of Grace that we've been saying is not so that we become better people or even better Christians, but the goal really, the purpose that God has given to us for these spiritual disciplines is for us to become Christ-like in our thoughts, in our affections, in our emotions, and in our daily lives. And the only way to do that is to to have the habit of getting to know God, getting to spend time with God. Today, what we're going to see is the discipline of finding rest. And you might think, well, this is one where you don't have to convince us to pursue this discipline. But I think what we'll see is rest is something harder than we think it is, because the kind of rest that God desires for us, the discipline of resting, is not simply to watch TV, to veg out, to do nothing, to be lazy. But the kind of rest that God is calling for us is actually extremely hard and extremely difficult. When Paul Tripp, a Christian author, one that I admire truly, he was asked, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing the church today? He responded, it's the insane busyness of our Western culture. And that insane busyness is incapable of producing faithfulness to the mission of the church. He goes on, we load our schedules too much, and when we try to squeeze the mission of the church into that schedule, there's no space left. What sets our values drives the schedule of our lives. And so last week we looked at the passage where Jesus tells us we can't have two masters. The same can be said about our schedules, our priorities. We can't serve our schedules and also the Lord. And so all of these disciplines are interrelated. Oftentimes, so many of us are so busy because we've bought into the dream, the American dream of being successful, of being rich. And to squeeze church, to squeeze the kingdom of God into that, we find it more and more difficult. And I've experienced it everywhere in church. No matter where I have served, people have always had the excuse or the reasoning, oh, we couldn't make it out because of X, Y, or Z. And the idea was that they're busy. There are other things that take up their time, their schedule, that they can't fit in church. And so immediately, without judging them, and this is something that I have to think about as well, even as a pastor, what are our priorities, our values? Because if we place the kingdom of God and if we place our relationship with the Lord as a priority, our schedule will look like that, and then we'll squeeze other things into that schedule. But so often, it doesn't work like that. We find ourselves understanding that it's difficult sometimes to make it out to church, to make it out to community group, to make it out to any church event. Judith Shulevitz, in a New York Times article in the early 2000s, she started to realize this even in her own life as a non-Christian, that the busyness of the work grind and the pressure of our culture, it got to her. I want to read you part of her article from the New York Times. She writes, my mood would darken until by Saturday afternoon, I'd be unresponsive and morose. My normal routine, which involved brunch with friends and swapping tales of misadventure and the relentless quest for romance and professional success, it made me feel impossibly restless. I started spending Saturdays by myself, and after a while I got lonely and did something that as a teenager profoundly put off by her religious education I could never have imagined wanting to do. I began dropping in on a nearby synagogue. She goes on to write, there is ample evidence that our relationship to work is out of whack. Economists, psychologists, sociologists have charted our ballooning work hours, the increase in time devoted to competitive shopping, the commercialization of leisure that turns fun into work, requires military-scale budgeting and logistics and emotionally draining interactions with service personnel. But I won't weary you with cautionary tales about what our work-addicted culture can do to you, psychologically or physiologically, because, for one thing, it's completely within your power to hold it at bay. And for another, you don't want to anyway. Ours is a society that pegs status to overachievement, and we can't help admiring our workaholics. And so her goal in this article was to show, and it's paraphrasing, that it's to argue for the good and for the necessity of taking Sabbath rest. And for her, a Jew, it was to go to the synagogue on Saturday. But in a world obsessed with work and overworking, her argument was we all need to slow down and find rest. Then she says something so insightful. Most people mistakenly believe that all you have to do to stop working is to not work. But the inventors of the Sabbath understood that it was a much more complicated undertaking. You cannot downshift casually and easily. And this is why the Puritans and Jewish Sabbaths were so exactingly intentional. It required extensive advanced preparation. The rules did not exist to torture the faithful. They were meant to communicate the insight that interrupting the ceaseless round of striving requires a surprisingly strenuous act of will, one that has to be bolstered by habit. I want us to understand that it's hard for us to stop and to slow down. We all want to stop and slow down. We all want vacations. We all want to spend time sort of just vegging out in front of the couch, but it's hard to do that even with a sense of trust. And what I want us to understand today, that rest, it's a spiritual discipline, one that is often overlooked, often misunderstood, often misused, because we think, oh, if I'm going to rest and have the spiritual discipline of resting, that means I'm not going to go to class, or I'm going to go be lazy, or I'm not going to show up to this, or I'm going to let go of certain responsibilities. And so it's easily misunderstood and misused, and yet we need this discipline of rest. This is an observation that Tim Keller makes about the Sabbath. The Sabbath, resting, is one of the 10 commandments. Do you realize what that means? A society that encourages overwork is as brutalizing, as depersonalizing, as dehumanizing as a society that encourages stealing, adultery, and killing. Don't you find it odd that God chose to keep the Sabbath holy amongst all the other commandments that we all agree those are bad things to do? It's bad to steal, it's bad to murder, it's bad to covet, it's bad to commit adultery, but to not keep the Sabbath holy. Some of us think, well, the Sabbath is for me. The Bible even says God made the Sabbath for man. I think for us to understand this morning, your and my busyness or our lack of rest, which is two sides of the same coin, it is a threat to our spiritual well-being. Being too busy and not being able to rest, two sides of the same coin, it's a threat to your relationship with God, a threat to your spiritual well-being. For most of us, I think work is how we see much of our value and worth. Work is where we find our identity. That what you do in your job and workplace is who you are. And that's why we strain and pressure ourselves so much to get into the right schools, to have the right major, to find the right company, to have the right position, because so much of our worth and so much of our value is placed in that title and what we do, how much we make, what social class we belong to. And as a result, we never stop working because that's where we find our value. And as a result, we're always tired. We always have the lights on thinking, how can I get to the next stage, the next position, the next thing? Because for a lot of us, that's what work is. It's our value. It's our worth. And so there has never been a more workaholic, work-obsessed culture than ours today. And even when we come home, I think the parents will agree, it doesn't stop. The same author, Judith Shulevich, she wrote a different article about parenting. She says, in a society that measures status in achievement, in grades and awards, in getting into the right schools, the scramble for advantage is bound to propel us into overparenting. And overparenting is closely linked to overwork. It's harder to opt out than you think, for we use our children now to jockey for individual status. I feel this relentless pressure too, this incredible temptation that I need to provide something bigger and better than I had as a kid for my child. I remember a few weeks ago, Anna showed me an Instagram post by one of the moms in Teddy's daycare. And she showed it to me, and it was a classmate of Teddy's. He had a soccer uniform on, and the tagline was, this person was going to soccer camp. And Anna mentions, is Teddy missing out on something? Should we sign him up for a soccer camp or baseball camp or this? And I, immediately was like trying to be reasonable. Of course not. We're not missing out. He's doing fine. We don't need to keep up with everybody else. But deep down, I thought, what if he is missing out? What if he isn't the best-dressed kid in school? What if he isn't the smartest kid? What if he isn't the most charismatic, best-looking, holy Christian kid in school? What if he's not all those things? And it made me wonder, does that make me feel a certain way about myself? And it made me realize that even parenting becomes this relentless search for value and worth, this work that we're doing. And so when we think about why should we rest, I think when we're busy, we don't get the opportunity to slow down and to look at our lives and to refocus. For a lot of us, when we rest, it's not about being lazy, but we need space and time to regain a spiritual